What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Total Fitness Podcast. This is my first solo episode in a really long time. Haven't really done an episode in general in a long time. 2025, we're a little bit slower on the episodes, but definitely very, very slow on the solo podcast episodes. If you've listened to any of the solo episodes in the past, you know that this is pretty much a gold mine for a lot of different training gems because I get super, super deep into the weeds on a lot of different topics. And so if you're really looking to learn, I guess the most that you can about training for ultimate in the Instagram reels that I post, obviously that's only like 20 to 40 seconds of information. There's only so, far into a topic that you can go. YouTube videos been doing a little bit more of recently. Guess you can get a little bit deeper in that, but still the pace of those has to be a little bit quicker. People click away, right? They've got to be a little bit more engaging. But man, these solo podcast episodes are just where I can really, really dive deep into a topic. And what we're doing today is I had some questions off of Instagram. I did a little Q&A, just got some general questions about ultimate Frisbee training. Picked some of the best ones that I thought would do well here, some good topics that I could talk about, and just going to really dive into them here. Now, quick life update before we get started on that. As many of you might know by now, it's February when I'm recording this, probably going to be February when I post this. I moved to Japan back in August. It's February 2026, August 2025. So about 6 months ago, I moved to Japan. I live and work here now. So I work for a pro basketball team here in Japan, Japan's top league. Work for a pro basketball team as an assistant strength and conditioning coach. So with me, it's always been a dream of mine to be able to live and work in Japan. So worked pretty hard to be able to build up the experience, build up, I guess, the ability just to be able to get a job out here in the pro league, be able to move out here. So that's been going on with me. Live and work out here in Japan. As far as ultimate goes, obviously the ultimate scene is very, very different out here. And because of work, I got a full-time job now in person. Also got all the Tobu stuff going on. Just don't really have the means to be able to commit to a club team out here and go to all the practices and stuff like that. So as far as ultimate for myself goes, I don't really play as much. Don't really even go to pickup all that much anymore. I still love to train, of course. So if you've been keeping up on Instagram, you've seen me continue to do stuff in the gym, even go out to the field, continue to train that way. I've been picking up at different tournaments. So really just with a lot of different international pickup teams, kind of in tournaments all over Asia. Got a tournament in Japan coming up next week, again, at the time that I'm recording this. And so constantly just trying to keep myself in shape. Obviously, I still love to play Ultimate, be able to connect with people, connect with a lot of friends from back home as well, being able to play with them. And so really excited that way. But yeah, as far as Ultimate for me goes, it's definitely on the back burner now. Not that I was ever, none of the stuff from Tobu was ever popular because of Justin as a player is always Justin as a coach. And of course, that's going to continue as well. What's going to happen with Tobu, it's pretty much going to be the same. I mean, the last 6 months, it's been the same, right? Still, we're going to be coming at you with a lot of the content, the podcasts, YouTube videos, of course, Instagram reels, going to continue to come as well. And the same coaching service is also still available. We've been working with a lot of the same people. Again, majority of my clients are in the States, but we've got clients pretty much all over the world, and all that stuff is going to continue as well. So yeah, if you're interested in coaching, of course, that's down below, or you can check out the link. Yeah, check out the link below. If you're on Instagram, you can check out the link in my bio there to be able to apply for one-on-one coaching. But yeah, all this stuff with Tobu is still going to stay the same. Now, enough of all that stuff. There's things that you came here for. Let's get into some of the questions. Kind of going in order here of, I guess, how long I think the topic is going to take to explain kind of how deep we're going to go into it. So some of these first ones definitely going to go a little bit more in depth, talk about them for a little bit longer, and then as we go, the questions I think will get a little bit shorter. But number one, how do you balance skills training and athletic training? Athletic training is a completely separate field, kind of more of a medical field. In this context, I think they're referring to just how do you balance training for athleticism. And so real quickly, let's just kind of define what both of these are to make sure we're all on the same page. Skills training, of course, is going to be anything related to skills in ultimate. So the big one's going to be throwing. I think that's probably the primary one that everyone can think of. So throwing, but also if you want to get a little bit deeper, game IQ, I think is another one. So going out and talking to your coaches, maybe working with your coaches on some situational type stuff, but also film study is probably going to be the biggest one specifically for that. And then working on specific footwork and cuts, actually going out and not just working on getting faster, more explosive, and all that stuff, but actually the footwork of, if you're trying to work on a specific jump cut, if you're trying to work on a specific 1-2 move and stuff like that, being able to rep that out, kind of like a wide receiver would. A lot of great players have talked about great ultimate players have talked about how they work on their footwork, and a lot of it is just reps. So that's kind of the skill side of things, whereas the athleticism side of things, I think everyone is familiar with getting stronger, more powerful, more explosive, getting faster, being able to jump higher, being more conditioned, all that stuff. So if we had to kind of separate these two things, what this question is asking is, how do we balance training for skill and training for athleticism? Number one is, you just have to figure out what your biggest limiting factor is. So there's no perfect ratio of, this is how much skills training you should be doing, this is how much athleticism training you should be doing. If you are somebody, let's say you've played sports in the past and you have some sort of background in being athletic, you have some sort of base of athleticism, but you've never played Ultimate before and you're getting into Ultimate. Well, the lowest hanging fruit, the thing that you need the most of is skills training. And so your ratio, right, what you should be doing a little bit more of is that skills training, right? Continuing to get faster, stronger, all that stuff, of course, is going to help, but it's not going to move the needle as much as skills training. And of course, that's just an extreme. I think everybody kind of understands that. And you probably don't need me to sit here and tell you to figure out what your weakness is and work specific on that. I think that's common sense. Everybody generally understands that, but that's number one. Now, number two, the big thing that we need to understand too is kind of the difference in what goes into training for both skills training and athleticism training. For skills training, important thing is repetition and freshness. So you need to be able to do a ton of reps of a skill. Very generally speaking, right? Somebody that, let's say, goes out and throws 100 throws versus somebody that throws 1,000 throws. Well, that 1,000 throws is 10 times more. They're going to probably get 10 times more out of that. Of course, that's generally speaking. A lot of the things like the quality of your throws, how well you're visualizing, what the actual session you're doing is, I know, of course, is going to change this here. But generally speaking, the more throws you can do, then you're proportionally going to get better in that way. Repetition is super important. And a lot of the research on skills training and what's called motor learning, or how well your body is able to learn different movements or different skills, right, shows that we need repetition. So the more frequent doses of something that you can do in a fresh state, in a non-fatigue state, is going to help you develop those skills or develop that motor learning just a little bit more. Whereas on the flip side, athleticism development, right, really prioritizes recovery. For example, if I do a super intense, let's say, leg workout, right, I can't just go hit that same exact intense leg workout the next day and expect to get the same amount of benefits out of that. I'm going to be super tired. I'm going to be super sore. What we do with athleticism training is we beat ourselves down, and then we have a period of recovery so that we can recover and we can come back stronger, faster, more explosive than we were before that workout. It's that dip down and then we come back bigger, faster, and stronger. Whereas with skills training, we don't necessarily have that, right? You don't go out and throw and beat yourself down with throws. You just do little of it. Think about like taking a medication or taking a pill. You just constantly give yourself a small dose of that. And so if we're thinking about the athleticism side of things and how we need recovery, how we beat ourselves down, well, first I think we have to back up and figure out how much ultimate you're playing, because ultimate in itself is athleticism training, right? You're going out, you're sprinting, you're jumping, you're cutting, you're working your conditioning a ton. You're going to be super fatigued. And if we're talking specifically about in season here, then this is the thing that probably takes the most priority, right? If you're like, your workouts, your extra throwing sessions, all that stuff shouldn't be more important than the actual game that you're preparing for, right? So practice and playing ultimate should be your biggest priority. It should be the thing that you plan around the most, right? We know that that is going to be fatiguing. It's going to require some sort of recovery. Now, what a lot of people do is they just try to pack a bunch of stuff in around that. So let's say, for example, you have practice Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Now, if you just try to pack in your gym workouts Tuesday and Thursday, so those days in between, well, Monday, that's a very high intensity day because of practice. You need a little bit of recovery. But now Tuesday, you're doing a high intensity gym workout. Maybe you're doing some conditioning and all that stuff. Wednesday, it's practice again. So that's again high intensity. Thursday, gym. Friday, practice. You get the idea. It's high intensity, high intensity, high intensity, high intensity. You don't really leave your body any of the time for the recovery that we just mentioned is important for athletic development. And we know that your intensity eventually is going to fall. Think about by Thursday, that gym workout probably is not going to be that high quality because you're going to be very, very tired, very fatigued. Friday's practice, basically a wash, right? You're not going to be able to play uh, at your best there. And so, what I really like, and again, this is specifically for in season, is this idea of a high low model where you're combining your high intensity events into a high intensity day. And that leaves these days for these low days for recovery. So, for example, in this Monday, Wednesday, Friday practice example, instead of doing the lifts on Tuesday and Thursday, what if we just did our lifts before practice? So, let's say we have an evening practice. Well, then Monday morning or afternoon or sometime throughout the day, whenever you have time, maybe you go in and get your lift done there. Now, because you're doing it before practice, it's not going to be super long. Of course, you can't go and do, a 2 hour workout conditioning session and then go do practice or whatever it is. So your lift, you're going to be able to cut out a lot of the fluff of that. Just do kind of the meat and potatoes that a lot of maybe your higher intensity lifts, your high intensity jumps or sprints in just a smaller volume. That may be some accessory work. And then you go on to practice a little bit later. What that's going to do is that clears up Tuesday. So now on Tuesday, if you have, let's say, like a mobility routine, maybe you have some mobility stability type injury prevention, quote unquote, injury prevention exercises that you like, or maybe you have some sort of rehab routine. It's a way you can still be productive, but it's not going to absolutely beat you down the same way an intense gym workout would or intense practice would, right? So it's going to be lower intensity in nature so your body can get a little bit of recovery before Wednesday, which is our now, again, high intensity day. This high low model, I've talked about it in depth in some other podcast episodes. I made an entire YouTube video about it. I'll leave the links and stuff down below, but I would definitely recommend checking that out. That's just kind of the gist of it there. But what we can also do here is on these low intensity days, this is where we could fit in a little bit more of our skills training, maybe at a higher volume as well. Because Monday, Wednesday, Friday, if you have practice, of course, you're going to be already going out and getting your throws. You're going to get your specific footwork because you're doing that in game or you're doing that by playing, right? So maybe Tuesday, Thursday, this leaves you a little bit more room to do a little bit more throwing. So maybe, if before practices, you can only get 50 throws. Let's say, well, maybe you can go out and get like 150 or 200 throws on these lower intensity days. Again, but because this is just throwing, it's not going to be something that's going to absolutely beat you down, destroy you, not let you perform well on Wednesday, right? It's still going to be some sort of recovery, right? Because we're getting high intensity Monday, low intensity Tuesday, high intensity Wednesday. That alternating structure of high, low, I think is really good. And when we think about, balancing skills training, athleticism training, a lot of times it's just I guess the question kind of comes from the fact that being able to balance all these different things, the gym workouts, the field workouts, the throwing practices, you're balancing all that stuff becomes daunting. Whereas I think this high-low model lets you just quickly kind of categorize, is this something that is high intensity? Is this something that's low intensity? And figuring out which days it goes in from there. Now, big caveat, of course, is I know this is something that is very difficult for a lot of people to implement, right? It's hard, if this is kind of like a professional this requires a lot of time, I guess is a good way to put it, right? If you don't really have the means, if you, go to school all day, if you go to work all day and then you go to practice in the evening and you don't really have time throughout the day to go to the gym and get your workout in, right? I understand that is the reality for most ultimate Frisbee players. And so good kind of alternative, or I guess something to think about as well that I do with a lot of my clients is this idea of these like mini field workouts. So let's say you got practice at 6, we show up to the field at 5, do, your standard warm up, do maybe some footwork type stuff, some sprint mechanics type stuff, and you knock out just a couple sprints. And then you go into practice already warmed up. Well, now we've gotten kind of this miniature field workout where you don't have to invest time going to the field on a separate day. And again, going to the field and doing a full field workout is a high intensity day. And so when planning around these practices, if we can just pack it before a practice, I think that's really, really efficient because you're already going to the fields and you're going to practice already warmed up. And so if you have the means maybe to get to practice a little bit early, do something like that. Maybe you're adding in some high intensity jumps in there as well, or maybe some high intensity kind of explosive lateral stuff, right? It's a good way to just kind of work on some of these qualities that you might want athletically before practice in a way that maybe is a little bit more manageable. And again, it opens up some times on these different days for you to be able to work on your skill a little bit more. So hopefully that helps kind of answer the question, gives you some ideas of how to balance your skills training and your athleticism training. Going into number 2 now is what should ultimate players actually focus on during the off season? The off season, depending on, what, I guess, how much ultimate you play, could be very, very long, or you could potentially not even have an off season. If you're like one of those players that plays college, club, and pro, you basically have, or at least in the States, right, you have overlap across all 3 seasons. So you're pretty much playing ultimate all year round. I think for this group, this really isn't as applicable. But for the standard, let's just go with standard club season, where you play from around March, April to September, October. You have a pretty lengthy off season outside of that. And so the big mistake I think people make is they just take a ton of time off, right? They just treat it as this time where it's like, I just absolutely beat my body down for the last 6 to 8 months. Now I need 3 to 4 months to just completely rest, not do anything, to let my body quote unquote heal. Of course, you want to take some recovery, but your body is going to do what you prepare it to do. And so if you, for the last like 3 to 4 months, if you just sit on the couch doing nothing to let your body heal, when you're done with that, your body's going to be really good at doing nothing. Right. So what we need to do in the off season one is think about building up capacity and preparing our body to handle the intensity, the volume, all the things that we need to do throughout a season. Right, to give you a very, very simple kind of analogy, let's say you haven't done push-ups in forever and you do 20 push-ups. The next day, you're probably going to be pretty sore. You're gonna be like, oh my God, I can really feel my chest and my arm muscles. Well, if you then go do 20 push-ups again, probably going to be a little bit sore still, but not as sore. And then over time, right, 20 push-ups is going to be super easy and you're not going to be as sore because you've prepared your body to do these push-ups, right? You wouldn't, if you just completely rested, like, oh man, I'm so sore, I'm not going to do push-ups for 2 months again, I need my body to heal. Then you do 20 push-ups again after 2 months, you're going to get that same type of sorts. And this is kind of the same idea with Ultimate. If we just completely rest for this really long period of time, play Ultimate, you're going to be super, super sore. And then if we just completely rest again and go back to it, you're going to have that same level of complete soreness because your body is only prepared to rest. It's not prepared for the high intensities and volumes of Ultimate. So our body becomes what you prepare it to do. So in the off season, we want to think about preparing it through training. Now, the 3 kind of, I guess, categories of training in the off season that you can go with are, or not even, you don't pick one category and go with it, sorry, but kind of the 3 things that I like to think about are preparing generally, preparing your specific weaknesses, and preparing specifically for Ultimate, or the demands of Ultimate. And so starting with general, the off season is this period where we can really build. Like I just said, we're building up the capacity to be able to handle the intensities and the volumes of Ultimate. Whereas in season is about expressing and maintaining. It's really hard to build up strength, build up speed, build up explosiveness when you're planning around games and practices, like we just said, right? With that high-low model, if you're just doing a short lift in the morning before a practice or whatever it is, right? It's really hard to be able to build up a ton of strength, a ton of power, a ton of explosiveness because you're trying to prepare and you're trying to recover your best for practices in games. Those are going to take priority. Whereas in the off season, it's a really good kind of window to be able to build up a lot of this stuff. So as far as this general stuff goes, big focuses are just generally getting stronger. And you probably want to build some sort of general foundation of strength and being able to move through kind of some full ranges of motion. So getting your knee to be able to be strong through a full knee bend, getting your ankle to be able to bend and move well and being strong through those positions, right? Not just how much weight can you squat or how much weight can you deadlift and really trying to max those out, but making sure that as you're getting stronger, you're also getting stronger through a variety of different movements too, or what's called movement variability. When we think about an ultimate, there's a lot of different ways that we can move, but generally speaking, your body kind of does all the same things, right? With throws, we have one specific way that we step out the flick, one specific way for the backhand. Like our body gets into a lot of the similar positions all the time, right? We're running, we're cutting. A lot of times it's doing a lot of the same stuff. So we're kind of taxing specific joints and specific angles or specific joints, specific muscles in a lot of similar ways, right? And a lot of these patterns happening in a lot of similar ways where the stress is hitting our body a lot of similar ways. So if we can move in kind of different ways. Maybe I'm getting my body into a deep lunge position that isn't similar to throwing, isn't similar to what it's usually doing. Can kind of be good from a health and a balance perspective. Also fixing a lot of nagging issues, right? If you're somebody that would say deals with a lot of kind of knee pain from cutting, or maybe you deal with some shin splints, this is a good time because we're kind of taking away the stressor, right? Let's say ultimate, the running, the jumping, the cutting in ultimate is the thing that is stressing those areas and causing the pain. Well, because we're removing the stressor or removing the thing that is causing the pain, now we can slowly start to build back up in a more of a controlled manner. So that's something as well from a general perspective, fixing a lot of those nagging issues and then building up a really, really solid base. So that strength, that movement variability that I just mentioned is going to help build a base for then when we have to do a lot of different movements in ultimate, but also from like a cardio perspective, right, we can build a really strong base of cardio. I'm working on a podcast episode all about conditioning and cardio for Ultimate. So I'll dive a lot deeper into that later on. But kind of a big mistake I see with conditioning with Ultimate is that people try to replicate Ultimate way too closely. Right? They think, well, we during a point we run around for this specific amount of time and we have this specific amount of rest. So I'm going to do conditioning intervals where I run for exactly that amount and then I rest for exactly that amount. So I can replicate the work to rest ratios and the energy systems and all that stuff. And I think that's way too specific because no matter how specific you try to get, how closely you try to replicate ultimate, you're never going to be just ultimate. Like you might as well just go play ultimate at that point if you're trying to get the specific work to rest ratios and all that stuff. And also, if we're constantly just trying to replicate the specific aspect of ultimate, then we don't ever overload some of those other things, right? Like we don't get the ability to just build that really, really strong base of conditioning. So I think in the off season, for example, if we're not on feet as much because we're not playing as much, this can be a great time to maybe do some longer conditioning where I'm overloading that ability to handle by having a high heart rate and just cardio for a longer period of time. I think this then builds up a good base so that as we get closer to the season, we're doing a lot more high intensity stuff, a lot more specific stuff closer to the conditioning of ultimate. I'm going to be able to recover quicker. I'm going to feel a lot better because I built up this base in the off season. So that's some of the general stuff. Now, specific weaknesses are things that you might not typically see in this general kind of this framework or this general category of off-season development. To give you just, I guess, a very a quick look at what a standard off-season looks like, or I guess what a lot of the strength and conditioning textbooks talk about. A lot of what I learned in like exercise science classes, what a standard quote unquote strength and conditioning off-season looks like. What we're taught is early on in the off season, we want to do a little bit more bodybuilding, muscle building type stuff. So you can put on a little bit more size, put on a little bit more muscle. Now, somebody that has more muscle, now we can turn that into strength. So we can do a little bit more higher weight type stuff. So we can take that bigger muscle, we can make it stronger. And then as we get even closer to the season, now we've got that newfound strength. Now we're going to do a little bit more power training so we can produce a little bit more speed. We can take that strength, turn it into power. So we've gone through this progression of building a bigger muscle, making it stronger, then making it more powerful, and then boom, going into the in season. And all that makes sense, right? There's obviously a reason that has kind of been preached through strength and conditioning education for a really long time. And for most people, that works. But there are some cases where maybe you have a specific weakness, you have some specific area of improvement that falls way outside of that, that would be better for you to develop. For example, immediately somebody that comes to mind is one of the players on the basketball team that I currently work with. I came here in August, which is early in the off season for basketball, and he is very, very strong for his size and for a basketball player. This dude can deadlift like 500 pounds. So the thing that's going to elevate his game as a basketball player isn't him getting his deadlift from 500 pounds to 550 pounds, like a traditional strength and conditioning, um, education or progression would tell you to do, right? I wanted to work on the other side of the spectrum with him. So he already has a ton of strength. Let's work a lot more on the speed stuff, a lot more of the stuff where we're not using a weight, plyometrics, getting him really springy, getting him bouncy, getting him to use that strength and turn it into speed. And even a lot of the weighted stuff that we were doing was super, super light. We're focusing on moving it fast and doing a lot of this stuff that you might typically see as quote unquote in season training, but doing it really early on in the off season because that is the thing that his body needs the most and the thing that we need the most amount of time probably to be able to develop. So doing it really early on in the off season. And for him, his speed went up quite a bit. His jumping and his vert went up quite a bit, even though we were going outside of what is typically recommended with a strength and conditioning off season. So that's just something to think about. So with some of the ultimate players that I work with, right, really early on in the off season, I immediately start to introduce some speed work because I think having a longer period of time working on speed is something that is their specific weakness and would help develop them the most. So that's just something to kind of think about. There might be some cases where you want to add in some of these specific weaknesses way earlier on. Now, another aspect of this too is that it's really hard to build strength and power while you're competing. All right. Like I mentioned, if you were practicing a ton, you're going to need some sort of recovery. And again, the amount of time that you have for those lifts is really short in season if you're kind of planning it well around recovery, but also just the fact that even if you're playing around recovery as best as you can, over the course of a season, fatigue is going to build. So when you're fatigued, it's really hard for you to be able to build that strength, build that power to your maximum capacity. And fatigue's just going to mask the progress. So when we have more control over everything like we do in the off season, I think this is a tremendous time to be able to build a little bit more of that strength, power, and speed, like I was mentioning. So like I said, some players that I work with, I introduce them to that speed stuff way earlier on because I know I don't have to worry about if they're going to be able to recover well from practice or if they're already coming into these trainings really fatigued from practice, right? I know all the variables that are going into these training sessions and I have full control over that. I can control how much sprinting they're doing, how much cutting they're doing, how much conditioning they're doing. So I have a general idea of how much fatigue they're accumulating. I have more control over that. Whereas when we're also having to manage practices, pods, all that stuff, it's less control. So that's just something to think about too, is off season, we can really push a lot of these training qualities way more than we can in season because we have a lot more control. Not just with athleticism training though, but also the skills training like we were talking about before, right? You're able to push this a little bit more too, because it's really hard to do intense skills workouts when you're in season. Right? You can go out and throw all day long, and that's what's typically thought of as skills training. But I talked about before. I made a whole video about this, so I recommend checking that out as well. But these like self toss throwing drills are something that I feel like, right? Again, caveat: I'm not a good player by any means, but I definitely went from a point where I could only ever catch a disc and dump it to a point where I feel confident, like stepping into a handler role if I need to, by doing a lot of these kind of self-toss throwing drills where I take a disc, I throw it out in front of me, sprint onto it, catch it, and then I'm going into break mark, or I'm going into trying to immediately hit or yeah, if I'm with a partner, going to break mark, or if I'm by myself, I'm trying to immediately go into hitting a target, and I can overload this so I can work on getting it out quicker, the throw, I return a quicker stall count. I can work on making that sprint into the throw a little bit farther. So I'm having to decelerate myself even more, having to stabilize myself even more so I can find these little things within the drill to overload. The mark could also cheat a little bit more, so it's harder to break the mark. So I'm finding these little things and I'm overloading these small little variables so it continues to push how well, or I guess push and challenge myself of how um, well I have to break the mark or how well I have to do these skills. And when you're doing a workout like that in season, well, that adds to the amount of things that you have to recover from, right? It's really hard to do something like that because all that sprinting and decelerating is going to be pretty taxing. It's hard to do something like that and then go to a practice and then be able to do your lifts and all the stuff that we've already talked about. But off season, right? Again, I can control that stuff. So maybe I can do a little bit more of these kind of self toss or more intense skills workouts. And I think what's also really good about them is what I mentioned. They overload the specific skill that you have to do, but also they overload it in terms of volume as well, right? When you go to a practice and you have a scrimmage, especially if you're like a defensive cutter like myself, right? You might catch an under and have to break a mark and hit a throw, maybe only like a handful of times in a scrimmage. But if you're doing it in the self-toss throwing drill like this, you're doing it every single time. So maybe in a scrimmage, you're only getting 10 reps of that, of being able to actually catch, read the mark, read the defense, read the cut, and get the right throw out. But in a self-toss throwing drill like this, if you do it 100 times, right, you're like we mentioned earlier, you're going to get 10 times better. And if I'm doing that multiple times a week, right, suddenly that's just compounding the amount of reps I'm getting of actually having to make a specific read, having to make a specific decision, and going out there. And so that's kind of guess kind of falls into that specific weaknesses category again, being able to find a skill and work on it, specifically being able to overload it there. Now, the very last category that I mentioned at the beginning of the off season is preparation for ultimate, and specifically the demands of ultimate. Because remember, our body prepares for what you prepare to do. Our body becomes what you prepare it to do. And Ultimate has very, very high intensity things. So even if speed training, jump training, cut training isn't a specific focus for you at that moment, maybe you're following that kind of general structure we mentioned before of like general strength, movement variability, working on some nagging injuries. I would still recommend touching up on the high intensity things that we need in ultimate. So like sprinting and high intensity decelerations and cuttings, not for the purpose of trying to improve those things, but just making sure your body continues to stay exposed and ready for those high intensity things. The worst thing that you would want, I guess not the worst thing, but something that you ideally don't want is going these really, really long periods of time of you've done all this off-season training, but you haven't sprinted. And let's say like 3 months, and now you go out and play and you sprint and you hurt your hamstring because you haven't sprinted. But if you keep up with sprinting, let's say at least one time a week, well, you know that your body's prepared for those really high speeds and those really high forces that you experience when sprinting. Same idea with cutting. A really, really hard deceleration, your body can experience like 6 to 8 times your body weight in forces. And so no amount of just general strength training is going to prepare you for that. No amount of stretching mobility. You can't stretch your way into being prepared for that high of forces. So continuing to do some sort of high intensity cutting one time a week, some sort of high intensity sprinting one time a week, I think is just going to continue keep you prepared for the demands of ultimate, even if you're not trying to push those specific skills. This section might have become a little bit of a ramble, but hopefully that makes sense. Those are some of the things that you should think about when in the off season. Going into section 3 now, most of my injuries feel like they're coming from overtraining. What should I do? Well, number one, we have to remember that there's no bad exercise. If you get injured from something specific, it's not that the movement itself was bad. It's usually just your body isn't prepared for the load. Your body isn't prepared for the movement. Your body doesn't have the capacity. Your body isn't prepared for the demands of that specific thing. It's one of my absolute biggest pet peeves is people being like, well, the jump cut will tear your ACL, right? You're doing some cutting is bad for your knees. Cutting is going to tear your ACLs or just ultimate isn't healthy for you in general. Like if we go to the jump cut example, oh, maybe you can tell I feel pretty passionate about this, but if you go to the jump cut example, right? And people go, this happened really early on when I post on Tobu is I would talk about the jump cut and people go, jump cut will tear your ACL. For every one example you can find of somebody tearing their ACL doing a cut, I can find a million examples of people cutting and not getting injured. And so it's not that the actual movement itself is bad. It's just that you are not prepared for the specific demands of that movement, right? And so I think it's kind of the same idea here, where it's like injuries coming from overtraining. It's not that the specific movements or anything is bad. It's not that ultimate is bad. It's not that ultimate is unhealthy. You were just not prepared. Your body doesn't, again, have the capacity or be able to, doesn't have the capacity or just isn't able to handle the load and the intensities at that time for whatever reason, right? This might be that you just have suddenly spiked the amount of workload that you're doing. I also made a whole separate video on this, but one of the leading causes of injury is an acute spike in workload. If you've been, again, let's go back to that off-season example. If you've been doing no sprinting for 3 months and then suddenly you start playing Ultimate 2 times a week and you spiked the amount of sprinting you're doing, that is going to put you at a very, very high injury risk, right? These sudden acute spikes in avoiding whatever it is that causes these injuries isn't really going to help out either, because that's not going to leave your body prepared for whatever it is. And so in the jump cut example, right? If you think that jump cutting, tears your ACL is bad for you, then if you just completely avoid the jump cut, well, what happens in game when you do have to do a high intensity cut or do have to do some sort of high intensity movement? Well, you're not prepared for it. So now you've done it. You've accidentally done it in game. You constantly make yourself avoid doing it in game. You've accidentally done it in game, right? Your body's so significantly underprepared for it. And then, of course, your injury risk is going to be high. The sprinting example, right? If you think that sprinting is bad for you or it's just not safe or whatever it is, and then suddenly it just gets out a little bit too far in front of you and you have to sprint onto it, or your body wasn't prepared for sprinting, now you have to sprint, right? Your injury risk goes up a ton. So avoiding whatever it is that you think is bad is not the answer. The answer is gradually exposing yourself to these things. And the key word there is gradual, to build up the tolerance. Like I mentioned before, in the off season, we have full control over these things. When you're playing a ultimate game or an ultimate practice, for example, you don't really know how many cuts you're going to do, how many sprints you're going to do. And so let's say, this is completely arbitrary. It's really hard to know these specific numbers, right? But let's say your body's limit is 10 sprints, but you go out and you play ultimate. You don't know if you're going to do 2 sprints. You don't know if you're going to do 15 sprints. It's really hard to control these things. Let's say your knees can only take like 50 cuts. You don't know how many cuts you're going to do in a practice or a game. Well, in the off season, we have control over these things, right? We have control over the volume, how much we're doing, right? So if 50 we know is the limit, well, we can start with 30 and then we can slowly build up from there. We can also play around with the intensity, right? If we know that 100% sprinting right now is not in the cards because of injury, well, how is 70%? 70% feels good. Great. Next week, we're going to do 80%. Next week, we're going to do 90. We're going to slowly build up that way. We have the control this way. Now, to actually be able to find whatever your limit is also going to be really easy in more of this controlled setting. It's going to be really hard to find your limit when you're playing, right? But finding it in this controlled setting, well, let's say you go out, you do, 10 cuts. 10 cuts felt fine. Great. Next week, we can do 15. Okay, 15 felt fine. Great. Next week, we do 20. Oh, 20 was too much. Okay, next week, let's drop back down to 15, right? And we can slowly try to continue to kind of build up from there. And we can build up the capacity. We can play around with the speed, the intensity. We can play around with the volume, find out what works, and slowly build up, gradually build up to make sure our body can handle more and more intensity, more and more volume, to be able to be more prepared for what we could experience in game. Now, it could also be fatigue, right? If we're talking about in season, if you're going through that model where you're doing, let's say the Monday, Wednesday, Friday practices, like I was talking about before, if you're adding in a lot of stuff on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday, now you have 6 days a week of high intensity stuff, right? It might just be this idea that you have no low days. You have no ability for your body to recover. So you're very, very fatigued. And what fatigue is going to do is it's going to change up your mechanics a little bit, right? When you're sprinting, you're going to be a little bit slower off the ground. When you're cutting, your body isn't going to be able to coordinate that as well. The muscles have to do what's called a co-contraction, where all the muscles kind of contract together to stabilize the knee, stabilize the hip, stabilize the ankle, and move. And if we're just even a fraction of a second off on some of these, that's where some of these injuries can happen, or your mechanics has changed. So maybe new muscles, new joints, new tendons, ligaments are being stressed in different ways, and that's when pain can start to recur, right? Fatigue might be changing up the mechanics to increase some of these injury risks. So if we can add in these low intensity days, if we can add in just a little bit more time for recovery, that might also be good. It might also be that you just don't have a true off season for your time to build up this capacity. Like I was talking about, right? If you play pretty much all year long, then you don't have that ability to go like recover a little bit, take a little bit of time off, recover a little bit, and then go back to the drawing board as far as like building up that general strength again, building up that movement variability, right? Getting that balance from a health perspective, fixing a lot of those nagging injuries because you're constantly playing. So maybe those low intensity days become more of a priority, or if you're just in the midst of the season, you're starting to have some nagging stuff come up. Maybe you just need to prioritize your low intensity days a little bit more. So what I would do is go through kind of like an audit of your weekly schedule, right? So figure out if there's ways that you can add in some of those more low intensity days, and if not, then you can start to quantify how much ultimate you're playing. So what I would do is figure it out in terms of minutes that you're playing, figure out the total amount of minutes of ultimate that you're playing throughout the week. Let's say you have 200 minutes and right now you've got a ton of overtraining injuries, a ton of nagging issues. Well, is there a way that we can back that down to, let's say, 150 minutes, right? We can see from there, does that feel okay? Is 150 minutes a week okay? If that feels fine, then maybe we can bump it up a little bit to 160, to 180, right? To 190. We can slowly, again, that gradual exposure, we can slowly build that up to see if that feels good. Now, if we get to a point where like 180 starts to become a little bit too much, okay, maybe we just need to stay around there for a little bit. See if we can change, again, change up some of those low days, allow a little bit more recovery, but you can have a little bit more control of your overall volume because, again, going back to the original question, you feel like a lot of your injuries are coming from overtraining. Maybe we just drop the total volume a little bit, and then slowly build it back up from there. So hopefully that makes sense. I would just do like a weekly audit, figure out what your volume is, cut back to what feels manageable, to what feels okay, and then slowly start to build back up from there, right? A 2-hour practice doesn't mean you have to participate for 2 hours. You cut back the volume a little bit and still play ultimate at a very high intensity, a very high clip. You're still playing with the same amount of frequency. Maybe we're just cutting back a little bit where we need to allow that recovery, allow that feeling good again, and then going from there. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have questions about that or anything so far. If you do have questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments or shoot me a DM if you want to get a little bit more in depth about this stuff. Always happy to talk about this. Section 4 now, or question number 4. How can I improve my speed and explosiveness? This is a great question. I sound like a broken record at this point, but I have a full video on this on YouTube as well. So go and check that out. The speed training guide. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about because I feel like so many people get speed training wrong. Or what they do is they treat speed training like conditioning training, right? You go out, you do a sprint, and you do it very, very fast, right? But after like 30 or so seconds, your breathing goes back down, heart rate goes back down. You're like, okay, I can sprint again, and you sprint. And they do that over and over and over and over. And they kind of treat it a little bit more like a conditioning workout because what happens is those first couple sprints are very fast, very good. But over time, just naturally because of fatigue, your speed starts to go down. So you might be giving your 100%. You're going at 100% effort, but you're not going at 100% of what you're truly capable of. And the biggest, most important thing that we need to remember when we're doing speed training is that we want to spend the most amount of time as close to our 100% speed as possible. And there's a big difference between giving 100% in the moment and running as close to it, what our true 100% speed is. Because sprinting is the fastest thing that we can do, right? It's a skill in itself to be able to run that fast. Or I guess it's a skill to be able to run at the fastest speed that you possibly can, right? Like it's a very, very unique thing. And so if you're not practicing running as close to 100% speed as possible, then you're not going to actually get better at that. And so it requires us to each rep give 100% and get as close to our 100% true potential speed as possible. And how we get that is we have to have really, really long rests in between our sprints. We have to keep the sprints relatively short. We have to keep the amount of sprints relatively short, and we have to prioritize feeling as fresh as possible for every single one of those sprints. So kind of to go into that, number one, right, of course, that the easiest one is just giving 100% speed every single time to get as close to our 100% true potential speed as possible. The long rests, good rule of thumb I like is resting about 1 minute per 10 yards or 10 meters that you sprint. So if you do a 40-yard sprint or a 40-meter sprint, you're going to rest about 4 minutes. And at first, this is going to feel obnoxiously long. So many clients, when I first start working with them, I'll program it this way and they'll go, I was good after 2 minutes, so I did it. And that defeats the purpose of what we're doing because you're going to feel fine. Your heart rate, your breathing is going to go down after 2 minutes. But we need those extra 2 minutes to be able to let everything else in our body, our energy systems, for those really fast, explosive movements take a little bit more time to recover and to replenish. And so we need that full 4 minutes in this 40-meter case so that we can 100% fully feel ready, so then we can give 100% of, or as close to our 100% true potential as possible. Keeping the sprints a little bit shorter also helps out with this. Usually once we get to about 60 meters, that's typically where we kind of peak and we start to go back down in speed. A lot of the data on like 100-meter sprinters have shown that they peak at around that 60 to 70 meter mark, and then they start to go down in speed. And we're talking the difference of 6.7 and 6.8 meters per second. Right? It's a very small dip, but nonetheless, it is a dip in potential. And this is 100-meter sprinters. And so for most normal people, right, none of us are 100-meter sprinters. So for most normal people, all right, we're usually going to probably hit our peak about 50 to 40 yards, I would say. So that's usually the rule of thumb that I give is try to keep your sprints in between 20 to 60 meters. So that way we're maximizing the amount of time we're at as close to our 100% speed as possible. And we're not hitting a peak and then slowly starting to fall off and have kind of that junk volume. And then the amount of reps that you're doing, I usually recommend keeping it between 3 and 6 to 3 and 8. Because if you start to do 10, 12, 15, right, that's when we get more into that conditioning territory where, again, you're giving 100% effort, but because of the overall fatigue, right, each one of those reps towards the end of the workout, probably not as close to your 100% speed as possible. And so I would do this stuff after a warm up, after maybe some sprint mechanics drills to get warmed up. I would do this stuff early on in the session. Like I mentioned before, with those mini field workouts, you do it before practice, because if you do it after practice, you're going to have a bunch of fatigue built up. So you're not going to be able to actually run at your true 100% speed. So I do it before practice, do it early when you're in the most fresh state possible. Question number 5. Should I lift or do gym sessions 1 to 2 hours before practice? We just touched on this a lot with the high-low model at the very beginning. I want to go a little bit more in depth into this now. And so this is something that I do with the basketball team that I work with now. There are some athletes on the team. Athletes have pretty, I guess a lot of freedom as far as when they want to come in and get their workouts, when they want to come in and get their lifts in before or after practice. But there are a good number of players that like to come in and lift before practice. I've also seen this done at the Division I college basketball level back in the States with a lot of different teams. And there's a lot of great strength coaches that have talked about things like a strength warm-up, where instead of just going through the motions and doing, the same old boring high knees, butt kicks, reach down, touch your toes type warm-up before practice, what if you just get into the weight room and you do a lift, right? A 15 to 20 minute lift that's going to be productive. You're going to get some sort of training effect out of it, but now you're warmed up, you're ready to go for practice. So you're not just going through the motion like zombies in your regular warm-up. You're doing some sort of lift. You're doing some sort of training effect out of it. And so that's kind of just another reason I've always really liked the high-low model and talking about doing these practice or these high intensity lifts right on the same day as practice. If you're doing it in the morning, if you're doing it in the afternoon, if you're doing it right before practice, regardless, you're already getting your body kind of primed and ready for what's going to happen later in practice, right? If you're going to be doing super high intensity stuff in practice, then getting your body prepared for that in some way, I think is really good, right? It's really hard to just show up to the field, do a couple stretches, and suddenly expect yourself to be able to do these super high intensity sprints or these super high intensity cuts. But if earlier in the day, or you got your knee bending and producing force and accepting force, or you got your ankle bending and getting stronger in that way, you've already done some sort of preparation and some sort of primer in that way. And so that's another reason or I guess just one of the other benefits is you're getting that training effect, but you're also getting some sort of like residual preparation effect for what's going to happen a little bit later. So some sort of, I guess, practical example of what this lift could look like. And again, this could be 1 to 2 hours before practice. These should be way earlier in the day if you wanted to. I don't really think it makes that big of a difference, but some sort of movement activation. So the beginning of pretty much any lift that I do for myself or I program for a lot of my clients is we do some exercises, some activation type exercises that are going to wake up the knees, wake up the hips, ankles, core. So getting the muscles in those areas working a little bit. This might be something like an isometric lunge hold, Copenhagen plank that's going to work like the core and the adductors, maybe just some lighter like single leg RDLs with a reach, some sort of lateral movement, right? Things that we're going to get all those areas moving, different angles through kind of a full range of motion. From there, you might want to pick 1 to 2 main strength or power lifts. This is where we're getting our strength work, our power work. Like I mentioned before, it's really hard to build a ton of strength and power, right? But it's really easy to kind of maintain it. So we're doing 1 to 2 exercises, just touching strength and power, right? This can be great. Let's do before practice. And you might want to pair that with some sort of high intensity plyometric, some sort of high intensity jump, some sort of high intensity cut. I've talked about this at length before as well, but contrast training is exactly what this is, where you're pairing something where you're producing high force, you're pairing it immediately with something where you're taking that force and you're making it really quick, like the jump, like the cut. Usually this can be like similar movement patterns as well. So like a squat, you're having to produce that force vertically. Well, if you pair that with a jump where you're producing that force vertically, or you're producing that really, really high or the heavy force, and you're going to that fast force, and that stuff usually pairs pretty nicely. And then from there, you can go into maybe a couple accessory exercises. So maybe I'm doing some split squats where I'm working through that full range of motion, again, working the knees, the hips, the ankles, the muscles that kind of connecting those areas, maybe a couple core exercises, maybe a little bit of upper body, right? Some other lower body exercises. You get the idea. Just adding in those accessory exercises based off of whatever it is that you specifically need. When I think these type of sessions don't really go well is when they're super long, like I was mentioning before. You don't want to go in and do like a 2 hour session and expect that to somehow prepare you well for practice. A lot of like hypertrophy for your muscle building type work. So if I just did like a ton of bench press, a ton of bicep curls, a ton of, shoulder press, pull-ups, and just absolutely destroy my arms, how am I going to feel when I go out and throw? Right? It's going to take me forever until I can feel like I can get my touch back or just be able to work on the skills as well. Remember at the very beginning, I said that we need more frequency and repetition of skill training, but we also need to do it in some sort of a fresh state. And this doesn't mean like get out of bed, you've completely, you've peaked everything around this throwing session, right? But going into it completely gassed with a bunch of upper body work where you just destroy your arms isn't going to be conducive to you having a really good throwing session and being able to improve your skill. And so that's where I don't like a lot of that like really, really high fatigue stuff, a lot of that muscle building stuff, a lot of stuff where we're chasing a ton of soreness. Like I wouldn't do maybe too much taxing conditioning before practice or anything like that as well. Now, a key thing that I do want people to think about, this is going to be a little bit contradictory to what I just said, but something to really think about is that a priming session is not the same as a training session, right? I can create a workout before practice that is going to prime you and I guess what's called potentiate or leave those muscles the most ready to go, the most primed and have the most potential to produce the most amount of force, the most amount of power, and just be the most ready to go for practice. So there's a type of workout that you can create for that. And then there's a type of workout where you're actually going to get some sort of training effect, which is what I laid out earlier with the movement activation, the power, plyometric, and the accessory, right? Those two are completely different. The priming is going to be a little bit lower volume, maybe lower intensity as well, and it's not really going to give you that much as far as a training effect. Now, I think a lot of people think about the training session before a practice just as a primer because you want to feel or the thought process is you would want to feel the most ready to go for practice. What I've thought about a lot recently is when you think only about it that way, then you're leaving a lot on the table and you have to really think about what your priority is as far as what you're peaking for, right? Do you want to peak for every individual practice? Or is more of your priority peaking for what's happening later on in the season, like whatever your big tournament stuff like that is? For example, if you have 50 practices across the season and you're peaking for every single one of those practices, like you're only doing a priming session or you're not doing any lift at all because you want to feel the best for practice, well, maybe April timeline, March, April, way early in the season, that's fine. But June, July, August, September, right? There's all these months in between where we're kind of we're leaving kind of room on the table where we could have done more training. Whereas if we go back to that 50 practices a season example, right? If before every single one of those practices, you're doing some sort of training session, you might go into the practice just a little bit more fatigued, right? But you've packed on 50 more training sessions throughout the entire course of a season. So as long as you're doing the high-low model and you're getting proper recovery and all that, and you're listening to your body and you're not doing too much, well, you're now 50 training sessions ahead of somebody who hasn't done that. And so as we get later into the season, by tournament time, right, you're 50 sessions ahead as far as your athleticism goes, right? You're going to be a lot more prepared, a lot more better shape that way. And so I guess that's kind of another thought process that I have as far as this like high-low model and this training before practice goes, is that it's just another way that we can pack on a lot more training. Sure, the practices, you might go a little bit more fatigued. There might be times where, hey, let's actually not do this training session before because maybe the ones early in the week just left us a little bit too fatigued. Sometimes you might have to call those audibles and make those modifications. But the general idea is that you're going to be able to pack on a lot more training, which is going to help you become a better athlete and just better over the course of the season, because the season is really, really long. So as far as maintaining goes, maybe you need to just touch on some things a little bit more. And so that's just something to think about. What are you truly peaking for? Are you peaking for your practices? Or are you okay with being a little bit more tired? Or are you trying to peak for your tournaments later in the season? Uh, Question number 6, what daily habits actually improve training and game performance? So daily habits, I would think about this. Now, I assume this means stuff that's outside of training, right? So stuff that's outside of like going out and throwing, watching film, going to practice, going to the gym, all that stuff. So daily habits wise, I would be prioritizing recovery. What is going to allow me to continue to feel my best? What is going to allow me to do more training? If I'm recovering better, then I'm going to be able to do more training. And if I can do more training, if I do skills training or athleticism training, I'm going to become a better athlete or a better player, right? So I'm going to become better. So if I want to train like a pro, if I want to have this really elite training schedule and the amount of volume intensity that goes into that, well, I have to make sure that I'm recovering like a pro. So maybe the volume, right? When I talk about this high-low model, maybe you're somebody that's rolling your eyes like that's impossible, right? The average person cannot handle that. Maybe it is not the volume or the act of that stuff that's too much. Maybe you're just under recovering. Maybe the effort that you put into your recovery isn't matching the effort that you put into your actual training. Going on training, going out and throwing, going out and playing is the easy part. It's everything else that you do outside of that that is the difficult part. So your daily habits, I think, should be prioritizing how well can you recover. And this is very, very simple. Simple in explanation, not simple in actual execution, right? But number one, sleep, right? Sleep is the biggest performance enhancing drug. I've heard this quote before. I forget from who, but I absolutely love it. If sleep was a pill, it would be banned, because sleep is just that powerful. We know that we need it for recovery. I mean, you could go out and go consume so much more content that would go into so much more detail about the benefits of sleep. Probably don't need me to recover or to cover it, right? The other things are eating and hydration, right? Nutrition and hydration, we know that those are very important. But I also think when we talk about eating, right, it's not just about eating right. So I'm not talking about go out and just eat all these kale salads. If you were doing a high volume or a high intensity or a high amount of volume or just of high intensity work, right, practicing, training, skill sessions, all this stuff, not only is it about eating right, but you also have to be able to eat enough, right? If your car is constantly going on these far road trips, you need to make sure it has enough gas. And if we think about our body in the same way, we're constantly asking it to do a ton of playing, running, training, right? We need to make sure that it has enough gas in the tank. So also making sure that you're eating enough. If you constantly feel super tired, super sore, like you're just not recovering well, and you have a lot of the other things dialed in, maybe you need to up the amount that you're eating, making sure that you've got enough gas in the tank. Hydration, super important there too. Also making sure that you're just moving and walking throughout the day. One thing that I hate is the idea of like getting to a practice and that's the first time that you've just like unwound after sitting at your desk at school or work all day. So some sort of light movement. The old thing about, or it's not old, like it's what everybody really talks about is like the 10,000 steps per day, that exists for a reason. Getting some sort of movement, even as an athlete, is super important. Continuing to get that blood flow is what helps out with recovery and just overall being a healthy human, right? A healthy human is going to be conducive for a healthy athlete, right? Great athletes really, or typically, aren't unhealthy humans, right? And one thing that makes a healthy human is somebody that is continuing to move, right? Move lightly throughout the day, is mobile, gets that blood flow, all that stuff. So yeah, I wouldn't really obsess over all these, advanced metrics or methods or anything like that. I think that's where we naturally kind of jump towards, especially with social media, with all the content that's out there about like leg sleeves, massage guns, all these, different things. Dial in these things first: sleep, eating, hydration, movement, and I guarantee that it'll take care of 99% of it if you have that stuff super, super dialed in. Too many people obsess over the advanced stuff and they ignore the basics. Last thing, big daily habit, is make sure that you are being intentional about what you're doing. So don't just go through the motions, right? Be really intentional about your recovery, making sure that you're sleeping on time, you're eating, all that stuff. But even when you're doing your training, I think a big thing is people just go through the motions. You just show up to practice and you're not really thinking about what it is. You don't have, a goal of what it is you're trying to improve. Or even just for the day, right? What is the one specific thing you're trying to improve for that day? You're going out and you're doing your workout, and you went through and you did all your gym exercises and all that stuff and you checked off that box. You went out and you threw 100 throws and you checked off that box, but none of that was really intentional, right? Think about it this way. If I'm squatting, let's say I squat 100 pounds and I'm brand new to squatting, so squatting 100 pounds is really, really hard for me, right? But over time, right, squatting 100 pounds is going to become easier and easier and easier. At first, I got a ton of benefits out of that. I got stronger, I gained a little bit more leg muscle, and then squatting 100 pounds got easier. And if I continue to just squat 100 pounds over and over and over, I get diminishing returns. I don't get the same benefits as I did when I first started squatting 100 pounds. It's going to get to a point where I could squat 100 pounds and nothing about me is really going to change because I'm not overloading that stuff. And so I think it's kind of the same idea. If you're not really intentional about what it is you're doing, if you just go out and throw your same 100 throws every single time, it's just like squatting 100 pounds every single time. There's going to get to a point where you're not really getting anything out of it. Going to practice and just going through the motions, doing all the same stuff that you usually do, right? You're not maybe pushing the needle on what it is that you need to be working on to improve yourself as a player the best. So find those specific things, no matter what it is that you're doing, find those specific things that you need to work on. Be intentional about implementing them and improving them so you can get better as a player no matter what it is you're doing. I think that's one of the most difficult daily habits because it requires you to constantly be locked in, focused, thinking about what you're doing, but I think it really helps drive performance in one of the best ways. And last question number 7, upper body work for ultimate players. Should ultimate players be doing upper body work? Really quickly, the answer I think is yes. Last time, yes, I made an entire video about this up on the YouTube as well. But why I think it matters is, right, one, I think it overall just matters more from a health perspective. And so I don't think it's as simple as like if you improve your upper body strength, then your throwing distance is going to improve, or your throwing speed is going to improve. It's not like a 1-for-1. Get stronger in your upper body, your throws are going to get even farther, right? Because if you look at a lot of the people that can throw the farthest or have the best throws, with all due respect, they're not usually the strongest people or the most jacked people in the upper body, right? Because throwing is so skill intensive. I even find for myself that when I get stronger in my upper body, a lot of times my throws go down because I feel like I lose mobility, kind of my timing and my movement and the relaxation that you need when you're throwing kind of goes away. So even though I've gotten stronger, I often feel worse in my throws. So it's not really about being able to improve your throwing power, your throwing distance. It's more from a health perspective, right? Because the shoulder can move in pretty much 360 degrees. There's a lot of different muscles that attach to it. It's a very kind of vulnerable joint. So making sure that those muscles around there are strong and stable can help keep that shoulder healthy for things like when we're laying out or when we're just making contact with other people, right? Being able to tolerate that, super good. Also just kind of having like postural balance, right? If we're doing a ton of throwing, a lot of times that's everything coming forward. So there's kind of forward, or what's called the internal rotators of the shoulder, can become super, I guess, overworked. So if we can work on the muscles that externally rotate or rotate the shoulder outwards, then maybe we can build up, or we can just kind of maintain some of that balance through there, just through posture and everything like that. So I think of upper body training more as a health thing, not super focused on the bodybuilding type stuff. So what I generally recommend is a couple sets, maybe like 5 to 10 reps of upper body exercises. And I think when you can do them like single arm, so if we're doing a bench press, for example, I like a dumbbell bench press for ultimate players over a barbell bench press, because using one arm at a time with the dumbbell just requires you to be a little bit more stable. Also, I think you can go through like a deeper range of motion. So we're getting those muscles worked through deeper positions and in different ways. But also, like if you can do a single arm dumbbell bench press, so you're only bench pressing one dumbbell at a time. Now we're getting some core involved in there. So we're connecting the core and the shoulder, all that type of stuff. So not looking to like max out, push super heavy weight, thinking about things more from a health perspective, stability perspective, as I think, that's what I think ultimate players should think about as far as upper body training. Upper body training also, you don't really need as much time to recover from that. If you do super heavy squats versus if you're doing a one arm dumbbell bench press, right? Super heavy squats takes a lot more time to recover from because it's a lot more intense. You're using bigger muscles, whereas the single arm bench, not as much. So maybe you can add the upper body stuff on those low intensity days that I talked about in the beginning. That's something to think about as well. So yeah, that's everything on upper body training. That is everything in this podcast here. We covered 7 different questions, a lot of different topics. Again, let me know if you have questions about any of this stuff. If you agree, if you disagree, would love to hear it. Feel free to leave it down in the comments. I think Spotify, you can leave some comments as well, or shoot me a DM. Would love to hear from you. And once again, if you're interested in coaching, if you like somebody to be able to take a lot of this information and create a fully customized one-on-one training plan for yourself that's individualized to your goals, your equipment, your schedule, all that stuff, then check out the link below or the link in my Instagram bio to apply for one-on-one coaching. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching this video.